Okay, good morning and afternoon, everyone, and thank you again so much for joining us today. We are going to be talking about innovative technologies being utilized across the United States to help monitor and reduce methane pollution from landfills while improving the environment, public health, and operational efficiency. My name is Lee Helfant. I am the Director of Campaign Strategy at Full Circle Future. We're an organization focused on addressing some of the most pressing waste and climate challenges facing our generation, including reducing methane emissions from the waste sector. We still have a number of folks joining us, so for the people who just hopped on, feel free to pop in your information, your name, your location, your organization, and something you are looking forward to for today's session. Today's webinar is intended to provide a practical overview of technologies currently being deployed to improve landfill monitoring, methane detection, emissions management, and overall operational performance. We know there is growing interest across the board in understanding what technologies are available today, how they work in practice, and what role they might play in the future of landfill modernization. Over the course of today's session, you'll hear directly from technology providers working in this space, and each presenter will provide a short overview of their technology, how it's being used, and some of the opportunities and challenges they see moving forward. We hope today's conversation helps provide a clearer understanding of the evolving landscape and supports continued collaboration between regulators, operators, technology developers, and community stakeholders. With that, we will go ahead and get started with the agenda. So we will, as I mentioned, provide an overview of methane as a significant climate and public health issue, highlight some of the technology solutions available, and briefly discuss New York's landfill methane rulemaking process. We'll also have some time at the end to have a Q&A with our presenters, so please keep track of your questions. And any questions that we can't answer now, we're happy to follow up about. We're also recording today's webinar, so we'll share that out afterwards, and feel free to share that with others who might be interested as well. Methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas. I'm guessing a lot of you already know that. It's about 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in its first 20 years in the atmosphere. To help frame today's discussion, I want to just talk a little bit more about why landfill methane is such an issue and also such an important focus for so many people, communities, and advocates nationwide. As organic waste decomposes in landfills, it produces huge amounts of methane, an extremely potent greenhouse gas that traps about 80 times more heat in the atmosphere over a 20-year period than carbon dioxide. And that makes it one of the most urgent climate pollutants to address in the near term. In addition to its climate impacts, methane also acts as a carrier gas. So that means that when methane escapes from a landfill, it can also carry other harmful emissions and pollutants. That includes volatile organic compounds, hazardous air pollutants, and odors that can directly affect nearby communities. As a result, landfill methane is not only a climate issue, it's also an air quality, public health, and community impact issue. Next slide. In 2023, estimated methane emissions from US landfills were equal to about 59 million cars on the road. And that's probably an underestimate, as we know. To help frame the scale of this issue, in 2023, reported methane emissions were drastically underestimated and were not based on direct measurements. So we know that the issue is likely much worse than what's being reported. And across the United States, more than 115 million people live within 5 miles of a municipal solid waste landfill, facing increased exposure to pollutants that escape alongside methane. That's equivalent to the populations of California, Texas, Florida, and New York combined. The good news is that there are already available solutions that can help landfills better monitor, detect, manage, and mitigate these emissions. Advanced monitoring and controls are becoming an essential part of modern landfill management strategies because they provide greater visibility into site conditions and allow operators and regulators to move from reactive management toward more proactive and data-driven approaches. Importantly, accelerating deployment of these technologies can also create meaningful benefits for the many people living nearby, such as air quality, reduced odors, public transparency and accountability, faster identification and correction of emissions issues, potential health benefits for nearby residents, and stronger confidence overall in landfill oversight and operations. Next slide. Presenters today are really amazing folks who have done a ton of work to give you a brief overview of some of the technology that is being deployed and emerging in this market. And they also demonstrate the true potential for change and also the necessity for us as a society to really make sure that this happens effectively. With that, I'm excited to introduce our first presenter, Krishna, who will kick off today's discussion.
Thank you, Lee. Hi, everyone. I'm Krishna Kataria from GHG SAT. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about why some of the existing approaches to monitoring landfills fall short and talk a little bit about how GHG SAT's technologies can help address that gap, and finally what that means for the state of New York. Next slide, please. So a little bit about GHG SAT. We're the world leader when it comes to high resolution satellite methane monitoring. We launched our first satellite in 2016, and we currently have 15 satellites in orbit, as well as 5 aircraft instruments. In 2025, we detected emissions from 127 countries, and we've been operational since 2016. What's quite unique is that the same technology, the same sensor that goes on the satellite, we also mount onto planes, which means that because it's the same technology, it really provides comparable information, and it allows you to actually look at methane data at different scales, knowing that the data is comparable. Actually, we can jump to the next slide. Thank you. So if we kind of zoom out on the problem, and again, I think everyone kind of knows what it is, right? But the key thing is that the inventories are built on models. They were designed for annual national scale accounting. They weren't there to design for operational performance. They don't tell you where the emissions are and how to mitigate them. And so I've got 2 data points that kind of help illustrate that from our data. So one of the examples is from the UK. This was a landfill that was reporting 40 kilos of methane per year for the last 20 years. And using our satellites, we detected multiple emissions that were in the 200 and 300 kilos per hour range. So the point is that the models don't account for these anomalies. The second sort of example of this is a paper that's referred there at the bottom of the slide that you can look into. But again, it was a study that was conducted over 3 years, looking at 60 landfills across North America. It incorporated over 700 satellite measurements and showed that there was very weak correlation between the inventories and the measurements. Next slide, please. So in terms of GHG SAT, really what we're looking at here is what we advocate for is a multi-tiered approach. So we have sort of 2 complementary products in this multi-tiered approach. The first one is satellite. So with our satellite constellation, when we take satellite observations, you get a field of view of 12 by 12 kilometers for every satellite observation. With the 15 satellites that we have, there are in orbit today, you can have a daily revisit capability anywhere on Earth, weather permitting. and satellites typically detect emissions above 100 kilos per hour. So this is really your kind of continuous wide area screening tool. And then the second layer is our aircraft instrument. So here you get a much better resolution, 1 meter or lower, and we can detect emissions as low as 3.6 kilos per hour. And so with this solution, it really is about telling you exactly where the emissions are on the site, down to the well or the valve. And what's really cool is that the satellite and the aircraft use the same technology, and so the data is really comparable. And then as this infographic shows, of course, what's really important is that it's not the only tools and technologies in the value chain, right? It's about validating with ground truth and following up with other technologies, other instruments to verify that actions and mitigations have worked. Next. So here I've got a real US operator sort of case study. So this client did two aerial campaigns. One was in September 2025, and the second one was in March 2026. The scope was 6 sites, and we've just picked one site here, Site 3, we're calling it. In the first survey, our client detected 99 different emission plumes, emission sources. And they use that data to execute targeted repairs. So cover placement, sump repair, valve recalibration, and they use the data to inform their construction plans. And 6 months later, we followed up and we only detected 34 individual emissions. If we looked at the total quantification of emissions on this site, there was a 65% reduction. And you can see those little pictures at the bottom. You can really see from the little orange dots there that there's been a significant reduction, both in the number of emission sources as well as the total emissions. So it was really important in this scenario that it wasn't just to find a problem, but it was understanding exactly where the problem is, how to address it, and verify that it's worked. And of course, none of this would be possible if we just relied on models. Next slide, please. So the last example was one operator, but we also have evidence of how this works at scale. So I mentioned it a couple of slides ago. There was a sort of a study that took place over 3 years, 2021 to 2024, with 700 satellite observations from 60 North American landfills. And it found that kind of really weak correlation between the models and the actual site level emissions. We're doing quite a lot of work as GHG Sat with WM Waste Management, and in their work with the US EPA, the same pattern has been confirmed across their portfolio, regardless of season, regardless of geography. Again, very weak correlation. So really, what does this mean for New York? Again, it's relying on a model-based system. Without measurement, there isn't that independent verification to actually know what's being emitted and where you need these measurement technologies to support that process. Next slide, please. So just 3 things that New York can do. First, recognize measurement as a valid compliance and verification tool. There are loads of technologies that are going to be presented today that are proven, commercial, accepted. Second, set a measurement frequency and expectations for active sites. And then third, use that data to feed back into the emissions inventory. Next slide, please. And this is really just to conclude, in terms of why GHG Sat and how we can contribute to this is number one is scale and a comparability. So with satellites, you can achieve scale. You can look nearly daily, almost anywhere. And with the aircraft, you can compare the satellite and aircraft data directly. Secondly, it's independent data. It's not self-reported data. And it's been peer reviewed by the likes of NASA and so on. So that means that as a regulator, this is data that can be used, it can be used for enforcement. And then third is about dual use. It's really about making sure that both regulators and operators can use this data, one, to enforce, and two, to actually drive the improvement operationally and to mitigate. So that's it. Thank you from me. And handing over to the next speaker, which is, I think the slides got stuck there, but it's Jarrett, I think.
Yes, thank you, Krishna. Hey everyone, my name is Jared Henry. I'm the Director of New Market Development for Cube Technologies. We're a fixed sensor continuous monitoring provider. I'll explain a little bit more what that means. So if you want to go to the next slide, Elizabeth. So just the high level overview of us as a company. We have offices in Calgary, Canada, and then Houston. Since we started commercial operations in 2021, we've deployed about over 8,000 devices. Originally, most of those were in the oil and gas space, but in the last few years, we've been doing a lot more work in other industries like landfills. We've now deployed around 250 devices on landfills. And so certainly it's a space we're continuing to learn and trying to improve our performance for and learning a lot along the way. So if you go to the next slide, just want to do a little bit of Tech 101 to explain about like how these systems work. So we tend to think of it as having three components. The first one is the hardware. So these are devices usually mounted on stands over the landfill's covered surface in the perimeter. They are solar powered. They don't require any wires. They connect to the three major cell service providers in the US. Each device has an anemometer, and so that is able to continuously measure wind speed, wind direction, and the device also collects the gas concentration. Primarily in the landfill space, we use methane, but we can also include sensors for other gases like CO2, H2S, ammonia, or if you're interested in air quality, NO2, particulate matter. So all of that data is essentially continuously collected every 3 seconds or so, and that gets fed into our cloud-based analytics model. And so that is able to determine like, is there an emission occurring? And if so, where are those leaks or emissions coming from, and how large are they in terms of emission rate? Then what the customer sees is get all that data gets fed into our web-based dashboard. And so that can be used for a couple of ways. One is just doing real-time viewing of the site, where are emissions coming from, looking at the data. And then that's also how customers can set up automated alerts. So just because it's continuous monitoring doesn't mean that you need to be checking the dashboard continuously or every day. You can have alerts set for certain emission thresholds to let you know there's an emission event going on, and here's where we think it's coming from. And go to the next slide, just to kind of double click and take a look at what that dashboard looks like. So this is on an academic testing site, which I'll talk about shortly. You can see the devices there with the colored numbers. And then each chart here gives you that real-time data. So this is just a screenshot. But if it wasn't and you move your cursor, you could see what's the emission rate at any given time, what's the methane concentration at each device, what's the wind speed reading at that device and wind direction, and a bunch of other data fields if you really want to dive into the weeds. On the right-hand side, you can see different analytics like your methane emissions by month. If you group your sources into different categories like working face and covered areas, you'd see that, as well as event log of any alarms that you're having on your site. So we can go to the next slide. I think the last thing on the Tech 101 front is, I think it's fair to ask, well, how well does this work? What is it good at? What are its limitations? So the gold standard in this space is the Simplex facility. So it's a collaboration with FlexLab out of the St. Francis Xavier University, and then the Environmental Research and Education Foundation. And so the right-hand chart you see here is the most recent round of testing, where this black dashed line would be essentially a perfectly accurate release. And so across 57 experiments, we averaged about a 10% bias. So that's the good news. The strengths is overall, we're pretty good at quantifying accurately. I think one thing to note around limitations is, there is variance on minute by minute estimates. These experiments were anywhere from 15 minutes long to an hour and a half long. And so as a continuous monitoring system, when we're just getting a 15-minute snapshot, you might have more variance, but over time, and as you collect more data points, that accuracy improves. And that's where that bias number is so important. And I'll talk a little bit more about where we can fit in with other technologies, but I think it's just important to note that there's no one size fits all technology. We're good at some things and other technologies are good at other things. So go one more slide ahead. So I wanted to kind of just take a moment to kind of pull up and take off my cube hat a little bit and just talk about what does this look like in a compliance or regulatory workflow. I think a lot of us are going to talk about a multi-tiered approach, and so I want to take a look at thinking about what are the regulations currently, and then what could a multi-tier approach look like. So if you think about this across 4 different stages. Currently, there's not really much of a screening requirement. I know that is kind of changing a little bit with some remote sensing screening for Colorado and California. But typically, from a regulatory perspective, you're not really getting any emissions data until the inspection occurs. And maybe that's a quarterly or 3 times a year type requirement using handheld or drone mounted instruments. Mitigation timelines do vary based on the different regulatory jurisdictions. And then your verification, in some cases, you might not actually know if, what the changes in emissions are until your next scheduled intermittent inspection. So if you think about what that could look like from a multi-tier perspective, if you can just click once on the screen, Elizabeth. Great. Where I would see this is instead of not having any screening period, you could have a technology, whether it's Cube or a different technology, providing continuous screening with alerts above a certain threshold. Maybe that's a regulatory threshold or a site baseline. And then your inspections only happen when you have those alerts. And maybe more importantly, you only then need to actually go and survey that specific area. So rather doing the entire site, which can be quite time consuming and expensive, you're able to kind of just focus on the detected hotspots. Mitigation would be the same, but then the other change would be verification. You would know right away if the patched cover or the fixed wellhead is actually leading to a reduction in emissions. I think one thing that's important with an approach like this is it's more performance-based and it rewards landfill sites that are performing well. If you're managing your emissions well and you don't have those high threshold emissions, you don't need to spend the money on these, 4 times a year, very detailed, and more expensive surveys. On the other side, if it's a site that has a ton of emissions, they actually need to be doing more, instead of only needing to do that 3 times a year or 4 times per year survey. So I have just a couple case studies to kind of close out here. I think I got a couple minutes left. So if you click ahead. So one example of like this hotspot mitigation and emissions reduction, this is a site where this one area is below grade. We're getting a lot of emission readings. The operator went out, installed a couple new wells to start collecting gas from the area, and also used material bentonite to seal where we were finding leaks from existing wells. And you see on the chart on the bottom of the emission rate over time for just these sources in that red box, they went down by over 80% after that repair work was completed. So go to the next slide. Another category of things that I think that's interesting to talk about, I probably spend an hour talking about, but I only got a minute or so left, is the connection between emissions and gas collection systems. And so this is from a site level where the operator actually shut down their gas collection system on 2 different occasions because they need to connect it to an RNG plant. And what you see is the emission rate spikes on those 2 days. We knew that wasn't driven by environmental factors because the second chart here is atmospheric pressure rate. So we know that there wasn't a big drop in atmospheric pressure that occurred at the same time. So it really shows that connection between the two. If you go to the next slide, the other thing that's interesting is if you pair continuous emissions data with continuous gas collection data, in this case, this is a partnership with LOCI, you can then see on a more granular level what is the connection, when a gas collection system goes down, what happens to emissions. One thing to note here, because it's an inverse correlation, the blue line of gas collection is flipped. So the spike you see actually represents a decrease. But this is a week-long period at a site in New York where you do see whenever there is a blip or an outage in the gas collection system, you see that spike in emissions. Okay, one more slide here. I think the last thing is just Lee had mentioned earlier that methane can be a carrier gas for other things. And one example of that is odor. And so we did have a couple weeks worth of odor complaint data from a site. And so we compared that to emission rate. One thing we found was the 3 weeks with the most odor complaints from community also were the 3 weeks with the highest volume. And so I think there's a win-win here where if you reduce emissions and leaks, you can also improve odors and air quality in the surrounding communities. I think that's my last slide. Yes, great. Okay, so I'll hand it over to Dr. Barber.
Thanks, Jarrett. I want to echo something that Jarrett said about a toolbox, because I'm very honored to be on this panel with a lot of great people and a lot of great tech. And in being in this industry for a while, you come to the realization that there is no one silver bullet for all of this. And a good program is to build in layers that overlap with everybody's strengths. So happy to be a part of this and tell you a little bit about Bridger Photonics and our methane detection systems, which we like to actually call intelligence and performance platforms. We look at methane emissions more than a compliance perspective. Obviously, that's the main focus for a lot of people here on this call. But as we've mentioned before, methane is associated with some other, carrier gases and other aspects. So you can look at it as a health of your system through methane lens. And so what we try to capture here is looking at methane emissions as a intelligence platform and not just a emissions problem. So next slide. So we are located out of Bozeman, Montana. We have been in this industry for a while now, where we consider to be the market leader for the aerial methane detection. We have some of the world's best operators working with us on a daily basis. We have one of the most extensively tested and validated measurement systems on the market. We have a very large global emissions database that allows for opportunities for AI and ML to drive insights. Over 30 plus patents and counting for us in this methane and sensor space. So next. And we have 3 different methods of deployment with our sensor. We can do a fixed wing, we could do a rotary wing, a helicopter, if you will, or we could do a drone. Either way, it is the same system put on each of those types of frameworks. Typically for landfills, we are in a fixed wing or rotary wing situation. Although if we need to get lower in limits of detections, we could certainly do a drone-based application. But for all practical purposes, most of the stuff that we do is in the fixed and rotary side of the world. Next. So just a little bit about, so as Jarrett said, teching out a little bit about how we kind of put our data together. We actually have 2 sensors performing 2 different things. The first part here is topographic. So we're measuring the timing of the return laser light. What this allows us to be able to do is provide topography, so sort of the 3-dimensionality or the height of the plume. And then the next slide, we match that up with the actual atmospheric part of it, right? So the amount of the return laser light, this gets us our differential absorption. We do some spectroscopy, which, I got the PhD in chemistry and still pay for that degree. And so it's nice to use that every once in a while. But it allows us to then be able to do concentrations, flux rates, and layer all of that into what we like to call the lasagna picture. So the next one. So when you get a report from us, right, it will look like the one you see on the left, where you've got a group location, a number associated with that. It will have a timestamp. It would have max concentration, emission rates, and then how high that emission source was, right? But what you don't get to see is really how that image all comes together. And that's with this lasagna, as we call it, right? Where you've got your base map, you've got your scan coverage, you've got your aerial photography, then your emitter group stuff, and then finally the gas plume imagery. So all of this sort of layers in to give you sort of your final product, to being able to localize your emissions within a 6-foot radius of that pin source there. So we not only provide sort of where or how much you're leaking so that you can have that for your emissions, but where, so you can go out there and remediate that particular leak and then fly again for validation, or use a handheld sensor for validation. But it really just allows you to prioritize where your leaks are or what you want to do with the information that you receive from us. And so finally, what I wanted to kind of show you guys here on the next slide is sort of the bigger picture here, and how we're viewing this. Again, more than just the compliance perspective, but a lot of people are taking landfill gas, right, and moving it over to either direct use electricity or cleaning it to pipeline quality for RNG. And I know New York has been really big advocates and pioneers in moving forward, not just methane emission awareness on landfills, but other areas that are producing methane in a non-traditional way, right? And so in this particular case, we're looking at a dairy farm, and for this particular aspect here, there's a couple of things to look at. One is the actual emission side of things, right? That this is a 62 kilogram per hour daily leak, right? That is occurring unless something is done to it. And this is just one small aspect of this dairy farm. In fact, this is right next to one of their covered lagoons. So you've got that, you got the compliance perspective, but then you have what really, drives industry to fixing things, right, is money, right? And so when you start to factor in, CI score, LCFS markets, RFS, D3, I mean, all of the things that monetize RNG and monetize methane or biomethane, when you apply that to a leak of this stature here, it becomes even more alarming to the owner of that said operation, not just from a compliance perspective, but now you're putting wallet money behind it, right? This is a $1.2 million leak, right? So I think that's something that we start to try to do a little bit more of, is bridge the thought process away from not just solely looking at it from an emissions compliance perspective, but a total health of your operation. If you're collecting methane or producing methane, then there's a monetary value associated with that. And we're happy to help with you guys being able to establish return on investments and improving the efficiency of your operations. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Melinda, I believe is next. Have at it. Thank y'all.
That's correct. Thank you. I'll take it from here. One of the benefits of now being several speakers into this is that I think you'll start to see that there's a lot of overlap here, and that we're kind of going to end up reinforcing each other's messages. So I'm Melinda Sims from Loci Controls, and I want to bring in the perspective here of measuring also the methane involved with the landfill gas generation from under the trash, which is really the perspective that Loci has started from. Next slide. So Loci Controls, for those who are not familiar, we develop technology that goes into landfills to give you real-time monitoring and control of the landfill gas collection side. So the methane that's being generated by the trash as it decomposes. We have 85 landfills across the US, over 50,000 devices deployed. I'm one of the original co-founders of the company, so it's been a joy to be part of this industry as it has evolved and as this topic of methane is receiving more of the well-deserved attention. Next slide. So I wanted to briefly mention, although we've been talking about measuring ambient methane, that currently landfills measure the methane that's generated with a manual process. Next slide. So this audience may already be familiar, but for those who may not be, typically landfills are required by regulation to measure once a month at all of the landfill gas collection points, which is tough to do given site conditions and given labor bandwidth, and it doesn't give you enough measurement data to react quickly to changing environments and changing operational conditions. So next slide. What we do instead is we add real-time monitoring and control to that traditionally manual process. Next slide. And what we can do is we sense the methane gas that's being collected. We send it wirelessly to a dashboard where we analyze that, and we provide targeted recommendations of what needs to be changed. And we do automated tuning to keep every collection point at the appropriate vacuum to be not too much and not too little to get your best gas quality without creating emissions. Next slide. What we've added on top of that is not only measuring the underground methane generated, but also measuring the above ground methane emissions. Because if you're only measuring underground, you only get half of the picture. And so by measuring above ground, this is also working in collaboration with Cube, we can see the localized emissions and coupled with the localized wind field, which can vary based on the topography. And we can tie together what we're seeing above ground to what we see below ground. Next page. So wanted to show you some results. Next page. So when you install real-time monitoring and control on the landfill gas collection side, we typically see about a 15% increase in the amount of gas you get. And because we have 85 deployments, we have a lot of data to support that typical increase. If the collection system is working well, then you will typically see about that much when you implement automated control. But we've never been able to say anything about what would happen to the emission side, even though we know a lot about what happens to the collection side. Next slide. What we have been able to find is that you can measure enough to provide real-time insights to actually mitigate those things. So if one example for a landfill in the northeastern region, a methane emission spike was detected early in the day. That particular landfill has an odor complaint tip line that the community makes ample use of, and so they got an odor tip line call later that day, and were able to verify that there was indeed an odor with a handheld sensor. And because we could point out where that was coming from, they found a torn plastic liner, so that even in not the active area, but in an intermediate cover area that they did not expect to have emissions, there was an issue that needed remediation. So the landfill guys were happy not to be chasing their tails trying to find that, and the community was happy that that was able to be mitigated quickly. Next page. And then not only the odor, but also for sites that have an RNG facility, like you heard before, where there's money involved with this, finding those emission sources is representing lost revenue for them. So being able to reduce the odors and also increase revenue by increasing collection is really a win-win for the landfill operator. Next page. That's the summary. I'm glad to be able to share a little bit about how important we found it to be able to look at both the emissions above ground and below ground, because without the context of what the gas collection system is doing, it's tough to have the full story in order to address effectively the emissions. So with that, I'll pass it along. Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda. My name is David Barron. I'm with Sniffer Robotics. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder. And I've been on a couple of panels with Melinda. I love going after her or with her because we're both our companies are landfill focused. Both got our starts and are primarily focused on the landfill industry, which I think is great. Well, the next slide, I'll take that in a little bit more detail. Today, of all the technology methods, you've seen a couple overview slides. Mine is broken down a little bit differently, right? On the left, we have regulatory monitoring. So today, landfills in New York and across the country are already investing per regulation and requirement to go look for their fugitive emissions across the landfill. Today, that is exclusively Method 21, which was an operator walking the entire landfill, searching for those surface level emissions, traversing at 30 meters if you're at the federal standard, or a tighter spacing based on your local jurisdiction, mostly based on the state. Today, the sniffer drone operating under US EPA OTN 51, which is an alternative test method, is an approved alternative to walking. So basically, the drone takes away a lot of the manual effort of walking. And I think it's interesting to note that both these technologies are measuring these methane detections very close to the ground, which is exactly where they're coming from a landfill, which is a little bit unique to the landfill industry, that where we have, emissions that pop up, as Melinda said, from random tears and cover integrity problems. as well as different issues across the landfill, like vacuum pressure and things like that. So these emissions come from the ground. So in many ways, measuring at ground level is an extremely sensitive and technique to do that. So we're a little bit weird. Sniffer Robotics is a little bit weird. 1951 is unique in that to measure directly on the ground level while we fly a drone, the drone is following the train, and we are measuring at ground level by dragging a nozzle directly on the surface, sucking up surface level air samples to the drone for analysis of raw part per million measurements of methane gas from that ground level air sample. So we'll see if the next slide works to show this kind of in action in graphical form. Right, so we're flying across the landfill, we're dragging this nozzle, we're continuously sampling across the surface as we traverse it. When we go across different plumes, whether that's in the vegetation or on the kind of open cover area, we are looking at the exact ppm that comes up. On the next slide, I have another quick video that shows, let's see, next slide, please. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, we got a little stuck. That's okay. The next slide is showing it in action across the landfill. So the drone is doing some real-time terrain following with a laser-based system to understand where it is. It means we are agnostic to the terrain in front of us. It means we don't really get stuck anywhere. We're 100% solution for covering the entire surface of the landfill. That nozzle sits on the ground, sucks up those air samples, and we are looking at the methane concentration therein. So next slide. So what the drone does is creates a whole bunch of methane data points across the landfill. So on the far left here, the Sniffer drone measurements come across as these small green dots. We're collecting at 2 hertz. It means we get a bunch of data across the landfill. Most of these are background measurements, right? 1.9 ppm or so, which is fantastic. Those are even no data is great data to say that you don't have a problem in that area. Now, when we do have a leak location, that shows up as a specific peak. And so that's the second thing here. The second picture is showing about where that leak is. And we can operate the Sniffer drone. I talked briefly that it's approved for OTN 51 compliance for replacing that person walking. But these first 2 steps can be operated in a non-compliance modality, which I think is really great as we talk about voluntary monitoring versus regulatory monitoring, because these landfills are investing on a quarterly basis per the requirement. But all these vendors, all these technologies we've heard about today are all done on a voluntary basis, which is landfills trying to do a good job to manage their emissions to the best extent possible by using all these technologies. And I think all these regulations need to give a non-compliance modality so that we can, take the test before the test, do the homework before we have to actually go do it for compliance, so that we can enable these corporations to invest in landfills without the risk of compliance remediation. They're going to do that remediation anyway based on the compliance results. They just want to get ahead of it, to get ahead of the timelines, get ahead of the pressure of compliance monitoring. So it's great that there is a non-compliance modality of the Sniffer drone, which is fantastic. On the right-hand side is where we start to hit a little bit more of the compliance drum roll of OTN 51, which is when we hit a leak location, we're going to send a person directly out to that leak location to do manual monitoring per the traditional method 21 in an outward spiral to make sure that we found the maximum meter reading, which is a definition ripped directly from method 21. When we find that maximum meter reading, we're going to dwell there for 2 times the response time, or method 21, and record that as an exceedance if it's above the compliance threshold of whatever your jurisdiction is. In this location, we plant a flag directly at what it is. This one is an area of poor cover. Just the intermediate cover is kind of worn away. They need to add some impedance to that location or increase the well suction so that they can tamp down the emissions at this fugitive location. What's great is that the operator has a picture of exactly where the emission is. They understand from the context of that picture and the notes we put in of what the remediation looks like. And in this specific instance, we come out there with a very good hydrogen sulfide sensor. This point is well above the thresholds, but we come in with basically a single-digit part per billion hydrogen sulfide sensor to then look at, does this methane emission also correlate to an odor emission? And if that is the case, it helps prioritize the response and remediation for this exact point. So if we go to the next slide, one of the great things about using the Sniffer drone, which is essentially an automation tool for someone walking the site, is that you get all the QA built in. Like I said, these landfills are already investing quarterly per the requirement to go beat down their emissions. The goal should be to make that survey as robust as possible and to make sure it has the highest quality possible. So that investment goes as far as it possibly can. And the automation tool does this kind of to the best extent possible. So we pre-program the flights in 2 dimensions so that we understand that we have great spacing across the entire landfill. The drone then flies itself in 3 dimensions per that laser-enabled terrain following. And when we get each one of these methane data points, those little black dots, we put a buffer on them that is tuned to the compliant spacing. So anywhere that's blue on this map is where we got perfect coverage of the site, or we got coverage of the site. You can see like there's a tiny little sliver at the very top that we missed. We leave it on this picture to say, look, we know where we missed, right? In a compliance modality, we would go gap fill to make sure that we hit the entire site at the compliant spacing so that you have no risk that you did not meet the spec of the requirement. But also it shows that we had great data collection. The QA is built in. If you look at these lines, you'll see they're extremely straight. If you map something like this from a manual study, it kind of looks like a half-eaten plate of spaghetti across the landfill, because walking is just a really tough job at these landfills. So to get the best bang for your buck on the investments you're already putting into the landfill to mitigate your emissions, automation tools with this built-in QA is a really good solution. Next page, we have these data we collect, right? We're putting ground level methane samples at ground level, which is where the emissions are coming from, gives us the discrete leak locations, which is fantastic for compliance. You want to know exactly where those leaks are. You want to know which ones you need to focus on, which is roughly gradated by concentration. Once we basically interpolate all those points to give you a heat map across the entire site, which gives you more areas of where investment needs to occur. When we're on a site more frequently, we can look at how those areas change and shift. This goes back to a more continuous operating modality of looking at your methane emissions. Is these emissions do migrate. You implement a fix, it might be durable, or you might get some methane migration. And then finally, we do estimate the fugitive gas emissions with an inverse plume model in conjunction with Project Canary. This was, someone also referenced Simplex. This was validated at Simplex. And I have a bunch more data on what it looks like and how well we performed. I think we were definitely one of the top performers in quantification, as well as the absolute top performer in 2025 for localization at Simplex. The next slide, we have a quick case study. This is, again, in that voluntary monitoring modality, looking at how a site can use the sniffer drone, use our data products to then direct capital expenditures into the site to beat down the emissions, which is, I think, what we're all after, right? We want these landfills to know where their emissions are. We want them to be able to invest appropriately and specifically to mitigate those emissions, and then end with a landfill with fewer emissions than they started with. So this is roughly monthly. We skipped April. I think it was weather related. But you can see on the far left here, bunch of emission points across the entire thing, some cover integrity issues, things that needed investment. Between January and February, they did a lot of that. They did well tuning, they looked at their cover integrity issues, and in February, they beat down a lot of their emissions. So between February and March, they started popping new wells to try and get even more gas in the pipe because they have an RNG facility, which I think has been referenced several times because it's making them money. I really like the February to March structure here because they put a couple wells directly on that red hotspot in the middle of the landfill. The red polygon is the excluder. That's where they're actively filling, but the red hotspot there. And what happened is that well didn't actually do what they wanted it to. They saw migration out to either side. It didn't have the effect they wanted it to. But between March and June, they're able to come in with extra impedance in those areas to direct that gas back into the wells they had. And I do believe they put 1 or 2 extra wells in. And the results here are interesting. On the bottom of this is we estimated that the fugitive emission versus the Semiflux inverse plume model, we thought they had about 283 SCFM of gas to be had, and so fugitive gas. They ended in June with 133, and this big arrow here is showing that they're measuring gas in the pipe in an RNG facility because that's how they make their money. They actually collected 200. So we thought they were getting about 150. They got around 200. Ballpark, that is actually great for environmental monitoring across 6 months. That is a fantastic result. What's also interesting is that, the quick and dirty cheap data product of just looking at the average part per million across the entire site and the leak count represented the same trends, which is good. You can get a quick and dirty look at quantification based on some other cheaper metrics. So the next slide, I'll wrap up with, landfills, I think, are the primary modality we started the company for. We're very well tuned for landfills. But it is interesting to note that covered lagoons have the exact same problem. And I think we need to be talking more about those places. DVO digesters, CSTR digesters, and upgrade facilities have similar methane emissions that need to be looked at. Wastewater treatment, I think, is also an upcoming place where there's juice to be squeezed out of some of these other applications to look at where their emissions are, map them across these wide area sources that are somewhat hard to look at, and do so in a way with automation and data quality built in. Well, two takeaway points on the next slide is that, like I said, landfills are already investing. They're already required to do quarterly monitoring. The goal of OTM 51 is to get the most from those compliance dollars. Why not do it in the highest quality way? Why not bring the automation in to make sure that you have good coverage, which both maximizes your RNG revenue if you have a plant, but also reduces your compliance risk if you're not actually getting proper coverage. And in that non-compliance modality, which I think all these companies are operating in, we need to enable in a regulatory structure a way to get ahead of issues and to maximize that RNG value. And that means, letting landfills do their thing outside of the compliance monitoring so that they can do their homework ahead of the test and they can get that gas in the pipe so that when they come to do the test, which is the compliance monitoring, it goes as planned, which helps for capital expenditures, it helps for remediation, it also helps for regulatory enforcement, which is a kind of fantastic trifecta. So my name is David Barron with Sniffer Robotics. Please reach out if you have any questions. I'm going to hand it over to Erica Parker from Carbon Mapper.
Hey, thanks, David. So first, I'm getting over a nasty cold, so if I have to hack up a lung in the middle of my presentation, I apologize. And also to the point of my other panelists, it's really nice to go last because that means I can abbreviate some of my slides because we do have a lot of overlap. So good morning, everyone. My name is Erica Parker. I'm from Carbon Mapper, and thank you to Full Circle Future for hosting today. I see a lot of familiar faces on here as well, so hi to some of our friends. So we can go to the next slide and we'll just get. So a little bit about Carbon Mapper. We're a nonprofit organization focused on reducing methane and CO2 emissions by providing accessible and actionable emissions data. And we do this by operating imaging spectrometers on both aircraft and satellites to detect and quantify those large methane emissions from individual facilities across the world. And a huge part of our mission is making this data publicly available and working with a diverse set of stakeholders, including regulators, operators, researchers, and NGOs like our wonderful host today. And before diving into the tech itself, I do want to take a step back and just discuss why we're interested in satellite monitoring at landfills. Next slide. So this map here shows the landfill methane sources across the US on our data portal. One thing that you'll notice is that these large emissions are happening across the country, not just isolated to one region or to a handful of states. And really, this is important because we refer to these as super emitters. These are those large localized methane emissions. And while the magnitude of landfill emissions can vary significantly, which I'll talk a little bit about later, just a small number of these super emitter events can contribute to a large portion of total emissions at a site, but also regionally. And that means that they represent one of the biggest opportunities for rapid methane reductions when they're able to be detected and then also addressed. And so that naturally raises the question of, like, what exactly are satellites looking at landfills and where do these emissions come from? Next slide. So landfill super emitters, on the left graphic, you can see that landfills can emit methane from a variety of sources. Broadly, we think about these emissions in two main categories. The first are area sources, which are those diffuse emissions that are spread across the entire landfill. And these are also things that could be coming through surface migration, through the final cover of like a closed area of a landfill. And these are much harder for certain satellites to see. The next are the point sources, which are emissions coming from localized areas that typically are associated with specific equipment or operational activities. And that includes things like the active working phase, gas collection wells, cover penetrations, or equipment leaks. And as you can see in the example on the right, multiple point sources can also be active at the same time at a landfill. This is something that's sort of unique to the landfill use case. In this case, methane is being emitted from both the landfill surface near the active area, and then on the right side, you can see that isolated leak is coming from the RNG plant. So if we're interested in identifying these point sources, it's worth understanding the different types of satellite systems that are out there. Next slide. So today there is a rapidly expanding ecosystem of methane monitoring satellites, and these systems generally fall into two categories. The first are the area flux mappers on the top. These are the types of satellites that measure over large regions or even entire countries, making them really useful for national inventories or regional emissions assessments or understanding like global methane budgets. And because they observe such large areas and that's their focus, they're generally not designed for measuring emissions from individual facilities. And that's where this second category comes in, which is the point source imagers at the bottom in this graphic. And these systems, like Carbon Mapper, focus on facility scale measurements by identifying and then quantifying emissions from individual sources. But both of these types of satellites, these systems, play important but different roles, and together they provide a much more complete picture of methane emissions in different sites. So let's take a closer look at how point source imaging satellites actually detect methane. You can go to the next slide. So on the left, you can see, I love this little GIF so much. It's one of my favorites. You can see how we go from a 3D methane plume in the atmosphere to the two-dimensional plume that you see on our data portal or in different publications. At Carbon Mapper, we use hyperspectral imaging spectrometers, which are deployed on aircraft and satellites to detect methane. And these instruments basically use the sunlight reflected off the Earth's surface to read those like methane signatures in the atmosphere. And the graphic on the right shows how this is done. Basically, methane absorbs different wavelengths of that reflected sunlight. And I want to mention that just like any monitoring technology, satellite observations are influenced by environmental conditions. And because Tanager, the satellite that we use, relies on reflected sunlight, which is like a form of passive remote sensing, factors like cloud cover or wind speed and like the surface brightness or surface albedo, these can all impact detection and quantification of a plume at a site. And these factors aren't necessarily saying, they don't prevent satellites from being useful. They're just simply things that we can account for when planning observations. For example, as more satellites are added to the Tanager constellation, we can revisit locations more often, which increases the chance of getting a clear observation between cloudy days, as an example of how to do that. So understanding both the strengths and the operating conditions of satellite observations also helps explain where they fit into this broader strategy. Next slide. And I think you've now seen maybe 4 different versions of this type of graphic, which is really just describing the system of systems or the tiered monitoring framework that everyone's been talking about. And I can abbreviate this part, but basically it's just saying that each technology that we're discussing today contributes something different. And point source imaging satellites specifically can be used as a screening tool to identify those big super emitting facilities or those super emitting events that can help guide follow-up and mitigation action. And all the other technologies that you've heard about today are also really good at providing different data for different spatial and temporal scales. And the key takeaway here is that no single technology or there's no silver bullet that can answer every question. But together, they provide a much more complete picture of landfill emissions. And that brings me to what makes Carbon Mapper a little different within this broader ecosystem. Next slide. So one thing that sets Carbon Mapper apart is that our validated observations are made publicly available through our online data portal. We have several webinars out there that kind of walk you through the portal, so I'm not going to do that today. But basically, our portal has different filters and things that you can apply based on sector, areas of interest, date ranges, or sensors, and quickly summarize methane activity for an individual facility or across a broader region. Carbon Mapper also integrates observations from multiple airborne and satellite platforms, but our primary focus these days is from data from Tanager 1. And as we continue building up the constellation, the broader Tanager data set. From a technical standpoint, each Tanager observation has a 30-meter pixel size, which basically means that each pixel represents a 30 by 30 meter area on the ground. And we're also able to attribute the methane plumes that we find within 50 meters of their likely source, which provides that useful information that can support follow-up investigations. For timing, for most non-commercial users, observations are published to our public portal within at 30 days after collection. And for partners that require more rapid access, so earlier than 30 days, the same observations can also be delivered through low latency commercial products. But as the constellation grows, revisit frequency will continue to improve, which will give us more opportunities to observe facilities over time. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of what each observation gives you, We have three primary outputs, which is the location of the emission source. If you look at the graphic, you have that landfill boundary. The sources are those little purple dots. And then you also get an image of the actual methane plume. And then you also get an estimated emissions rate in kilograms per hour. So rather than simply just saying there's methane here, we're able to actually show where the plume originated and then estimate how much methane is being released. Next slide. Providing actionable data also requires confidence in the underlying science. I'm not going to go into too much detail here other than to just say that we do a lot of validation. It's a huge part of our work to make sure that we're providing confident data. We do instrument comparisons to evaluate how well different measurement systems agree. We do controlled release experiments where we compare emissions estimates against known metered methane releases. And then we also work with partners across different parts of the sector to develop community standards. And then a key part of those standards is having a clear, robust QA/QC process that each observation goes through before it's published to our data portal. Next slide. So we've covered data collection, transparency, validation. The next question is, what have we learned through all of this work? And our work in the waste sector has really revealed a few key findings. The first is that the active work phase is a major contributor to total emissions. In many cases in the US, it represents a large share of what we observe compared to other sources across the site. And then we also see that emissions can change quite a bit over time as operations shift. Landfills are really dynamic systems. So by combining repeated airborne and satellite observations, we've been able to better understand how day-to-day operations influence emissions and how we can improve assumptions and models, things like how gas collection efficiency systems are actually working in practice. And in this central picture, you can see that the work phase is contributing that large plume on the right-hand side, but there's also those isolated leaks that are found kind of on the left, the smaller plumes that contribute a larger share to total emissions from the site in this observation. And the combination of sources is really what drives the day-to-day variability. And then lastly, you can also see that modeled inventories don't always line up with what we observe in the field. Krishna, I think you alluded to this in one of your slides as well, which is we've found that these modeled emissions are not directly comparable to what we're seeing from space. And so most importantly, I think these observations are just improving our understanding of landfill emissions, but they're also helping support mitigation on the ground. Next slide. And one of the clearest examples of how these observations translate into action comes from Sunshine Canyon landfill. This was a case study that we did a few years ago. So this landfill had persistent odor complaints from nearby communities. And then airborne flights in 2016 basically identified these large plumes coming from intermediate cover stops. And this gave regulators and operators something concrete to work with. It's not just that emissions were occurring, but it was where they were coming from that was really important. Basically, the regulators and the operators use that emissions data to trace emissions back to specific operational and infrastructure practices. And then from there, developed a set of targeted fixes for addressing those, which included updating cover systems, improving gas collection, and installing additional collection infrastructure in affected areas. A lot of these solutions you've also heard discussed in previous case studies from my other panelists. On the left, you can see that the results from this study, which is large plumes before the changes, followed by a clear reduction in emissions after mitigation was implemented. And on the right, the trend is the same. You can see the odor complaints and the methane estimates both drop sharply after those changes take effect. So this is just a clear example of how using remote sensing observations to move from detection to action to then verified emissions reductions. And we've also seen similar patterns at other landfill studies where we've observed cases where new well installation or cover improvements directly reduce emissions in previously active areas. And this is a good example of what's possible at individual facilities, but I do want to take just a moment to talk about how this is being applied at the state level. Next slide. So across California, these observations are now being used at a much larger scale. So there were early airborne methane surveys done in California that was basically ran on a voluntary response model where operators received information from regulators about observed emissions. And then some chose to engage by responding or sharing context, while others did not. But even so, that process really helped demonstrate that these measurements can pinpoint emission sources, and that pairing remote sensing data with operator knowledge on the ground made the data more useful. And then building on that foundation, California launched the California Satellite Methane Program, or that CalSMP, which moved from voluntary engagement to a more structured notification system. And then they have all of their data posted on their data dashboard, which is what this screenshot is from. But in just the first year of implementation, more than 100 landfill notifications were issued, and in nearly 50% of resolved cases led to confirmed repairs and mitigations. And this is just a good example of how satellites are serving as an early screening tool that help identify those large emissions. Next slide. And then lastly, I know this is a tech showcase, but I wanted to wrap up my presentation by just discussing how states are integrating satellite data into their landfill. And California and Colorado show two parallel paths for doing this. Both started at the statewide measurement campaign level to show using remote monitoring data to better understand methane emissions across different sectors in their state. And both found that emissions from landfills were both significant and actionable. In California, that work evolved from the airborne surveys to the CalSMP program, like I just discussed. But then they also incorporated satellite data into their landfill methane regulations that include a framework for responding to remotely detected plumes. And this rulemaking process was initiated in 2023 and then was wrapped up at the end of 2025. And then Colorado followed a similar path where they started with the campaigns and then incorporated the remote methane monitoring requirements into Regulation 31. The difference is that they're now actively developing an implementation guidance through a technical working group to figure out how this is going to work in practice. And the common theme across these examples is that remote sensing is being included as a complement to existing monitoring programs, not as a replacement for SEM or other technologies. And I think that's a really important point because it provides a source of information that can help prioritize inspections and guide mitigation and improve understanding of landfill emissions, ultimately reducing costs and mitigation timelines. And then also, I guess worth mentioning is Pennsylvania has also done the statewide airborne campaign and then published their results, which is really just adding to a growing set of states that are building experience with these tools. And I think that's it for me. Next slide. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Erica. And to all of our presenters for this amazing amount of information. I'm just always impressed when we've been able to sort of get in the same room and cover all of this, and how time flies. I can't believe we're almost at the end here, but I'm seeing a ton of engagement in the chat with questions from a lot of you. We will do our best to not only save those questions as we hop off here in a little bit, but also to follow up with answers and connect you to our presenters. They are great questions, and hopefully we can just continue to stay in touch. I also just want to talk a little bit about New York as a state that is really looking at a rulemaking process right now. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has committed to advancing a rulemaking this year to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from landfills, sort of in line with what we've been talking about today, and a significant focus in particular on improving methane emissions and monitoring methane emissions. Recently, they held a stakeholder informational meeting as sort of a kickoff, and we're just going to continue to track that rulemaking process as it advances, and hopefully be in touch with a lot of you all as well. And we know that some of the technology talked about today could make a huge impact for how states like New York and other states looking to advance regulations continue to address many of the issues named here today, such as methane and other pollutants. Importantly, DEC is also interested in states from other examples, some of which Erica just touched on as well. Next slide, please. Modeling demonstrates a huge potential reduction in methane emissions with improvements in gas collection systems and covers, cutting it down by nearly half by the year 2050. And paired with the technology that we reviewed, emissions can dramatically be reduced along with all of the other powerful co-benefits that we've been talking about. So Erica mentioned states like California and Colorado, so I don't want to dive too much into that again, but having approved remote sensing technologies and satellite-based systems and other technologies like drones, sensors have been a huge key piece for states like California and Colorado, but also states like Washington, which has authorized drones to perform required surface emissions monitoring under its landfill methane regulations. And this would just provide another alternative to traditional manual walking surveys. So with the tech available and many states already leading the way, it is a really great time for other states to also be looking at how they can modernize their approach to landfill methane. Next slide. And we have a few minutes left. We won't have time to get into all of the questions that have been populating the chat, unfortunately. But again, I'll try to make sure we get creative about how to keep folks connected. Any one question, and maybe we can focus specifically on community impacts. But yeah, if there's maybe one question to close us out, if you wouldn't mind popping a hand up. And like I said, we can stay in touch. So don't expect this to be the very last of these great conversations. Okay, Jennifer Elkins, go for it.
Hey everyone, Jennifer Elkins. I'm with Grassroots Organizers for Accountable Landfills. I also live very close to the Chiquita Canyon landfill in California. There seems to be a lot of really great technology available. So my question is, why aren't these technologies required at every landfill? It seems like resources like these could really help not only the communities, but also the waste companies. The data and information this technology gives can prevent really expensive disasters like Chiquita Canyon from happening all over and resolve any issues quickly. This technology seems really valuable. And then another question I have is, how accessible is the data to the general public? I heard Carbon Mapper say that their data is publicly available. And so is the same true for the other companies. Communities need data that they can trust in order to make decisions to protect their health.
Yeah, would any of our panelists like to go first? And thank you, Jen.
I'll jump in. Why aren't all these technologies in all landfills is probably a cost statement. And that's mostly driven by every single presenter here works for the landfill industry in some regard. I think we're caught in the middle of I think all of us are caught in the middle where we want to provide the best data to everyone. But the dollars are the interesting things because we do have teams that go collect these data. We have analysis costs for doing that. So the regulatory infrastructure for how these data are collected and how they are made public becomes the most important factor, right? So there's the voluntary monitoring where these sites are doing extra, and it's going to be hard to get your hands on that data as a community organization because they don't really want it public in some regards because they're trying to fix issues before the actual test. I do think you have the ability to FOIA some of the walking sim data from landfills if you really want to. And I think Carbon Mapper and some others are opening up their data portals via their kind of, I'll call alternative funding sources, which is great and a good way to move forward. But I do think having regulations that enforce the data quality on the monitoring that is done, that is required, is very interesting. I think CARB and a couple of other states are now requiring like walking paths to be monitored for SEM, which is interesting. We've seen some major fines out of certain locations, like in the Pacific Northwest, I'll say, where monitoring wasn't performed to spec, and now those sites are feeling the regulatory impact. So having regulations that enforce the data quality that are then made public, which I think I guess I'll speak for most presenters here that for the regulatory data that is collected, I think, yes, they're getting a path to having it be public is a really good way to do that. So I hope that answers your question, although it's a tough one in that the flow of how these operations work and how the money flows is somewhat driving how the data flows, which makes sense, except the regulatory structure is the way to combat that. And so public comment on these regulations is extremely important to make them as transparent as possible.
Yeah, I would echo all that, and I'll just add a short bit, which is that unfortunately, because loci controls customer is the landfill or the energy project on the landfill, we don't generally make the data publicly available. But on the regulatory side, we found that the landfills seem to be much more motivated by the carrot than the stick. So whereas they are very much afraid of additional compliance burdens, additional regulatory burdens, and the risks associated with that, they are very motivated if there are credit programs in place. And so California is a good example of that, where some of their regulatory policy is set up to reward or to provide incentives for doing a better job. And so in LOCI's experience, we've seen more sites receptive to that sort of approach. And I agree. I hope that these technologies could be applied everywhere.
Maybe I'll just chime in a little bit from from the technology perspective and what I've heard from regulators. I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem where like regulators have a pretty high bar for approving specific technologies, and in order to do that, they would like peer-reviewed studies, public-private partnerships, transparent data like showing how a technology is used in a regulatory sense over a long amount of time. However, landfill operators aren't necessarily as interested in spending all that money for something that isn't like a regulatory compliance option. I think the other factor there is a lot of the technologies discussed today require a very different type of compliance workflow. So it's not just, I've gotten the question, well, can you replicate or be equivalent to a Method 21 walking survey? Like, can you detect a 500 ppm exceedance anywhere along this path? The answer is like no, because we, read and transmit data in a very different way. We use emission rate rather than concentration. Devices are, far away. And so like that just becomes a tricky thing. And I guess to give one example from a different sector, when our technology was, and among many others, approved for oil and gas inspections, I think the description of technology document to the EPA was like 150 pages long. So there is a certain amount of like government capacity and time required as well to go through this process. I was told by a regulator in a different country, in terms of landfill regulations, we're really interested in these alternative technologies. We're just hoping the EPA kind of goes through that process because take any random state country, they don't necessarily have the capacity to like do a full technology study and pilot and do all the evaluation. So it's tricky.
Can confirm the alternative test methods are onerous to achieve, even when you are collecting 500 ppm along the path. So yes.
Thank you, Jen, for that question and presenters. We are going to close out now, but again, thank you all for hopping on. We'll definitely follow up with additional resources, contact information, and hopefully getting all of your great questions resolved. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.